We have some exciting news for you. As we've developed, you're going to hear a new term, the eLCAP. Everybody's here. We're excited to move forward in presenting our new tool to you. I want all of you to understand that we, as we go through this process, will be as patient with you as you are with us. Today we have our resident experts that are going to be presenting from business, curriculum and instruction, compliance areas. And let me tell you, we have a great team and a great presentation ahead for you. So be patient with us. We are on a live webcast today, just as a reminder to all of you. You can check your cell phones if we could, please. I'd appreciate that. And at this time, I'm going to introduce Yolanda Benitez. She is our Assistant Superintendent of Educational Services, and she's going to lead the entire. So at this time, Yolanda is going to take over. But welcome and enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for, as Dr. Ibarra said, it's an exciting time for us because we've been pulling all the business information, the program people, and their information, curriculum instruction. The work for today is in 4 areas. We're going to start with the local control funding formula and connecting that, as you know, with the eLCAP. There's still a lot of questions about how the calculations will be reflected in the eLCAP itself. We'll go through the local control accountability plan and its development, the sections. We'll be looking at the eLCAP adoption, what you can expect from LACO in its adoption process, review your adoption process within your districts, the information there, and also we'll be then showcasing the eLCAP, which we hope that this tool will make the work smoother and easier for your districts. To begin our fiscal side in terms of local, the funding for local control is Marlene Dunn from the Business Advisory Services Division.
Thank you, Yolanda. As she mentioned, my name is Marlene Dunn. I'm the Director of Business Advisory Services. It's really great to see the mix of business and program folks, because really, I think, as you probably are already discovering, and you'll learn more this afternoon, that the whole eLCAP process is really tied to your budget development process, and you really can't separate them. My goals for this afternoon is to hopefully give you a shared understanding of the fiscal components of the local control funding formula, because you do need to understand some of those components so that you can develop your eLCAP around them. The local control funding formula really is the biggest revision to school finance in California for 3 decades. We have completely revamped the way we look at state funding of schools in California. We've taken all of the previous revenue limits, categorical programs, thrown them in a blender, mixed them up, and came out with this new funding formula. It's really equalized funding across districts. We now have statewide funding rates per EDA, and then we provide additional funding depending on each district's demographic data. One of the most confusing things about the local control funding formula is the implementation. We're going to talk in a few minutes about how you calculate your target, but it's really important to know that your target is not your current year's funding, that there is an anticipated 8-year implementation period at minimum. And so it will take us 8 years to reach that target. In the interim, we'll see some incremental increases in funding. And that's one of the most critical things to understand about local control funding formula, is how that incremental increases in funding is applied. The other big deal about the local control funding formula is how it shifts the rulemaking from the state to your local districts. We're all used to the state saying, here's $1 for this specific purpose, spend it this way. And when you get that $1, you identify it in your accounting system and you track how you spend it. And that's all according to what the state told you you must do. Now under LCFF, each district sets their own goals, determines their own priorities, and determines how best to spend that money. And so that's a huge shift in how we think about funds for our schools and how we think about accountability and tracking that money. No longer is it about, did you spend the dollar right? Now it's about what serves your population the best and how you measure that success. When I tell people the first bullet, that the local control funding formula simplifies funding, they look at me and go, are you kidding me? This is not simplified funding. Really, it is. The revenue limit took about 25 pages of exhibits to calculate. For each categorical program, you'd have your own set of data that drove the calculation of that revenue and a whole host of regulations tied to those dollars. Under the local control funding formula, we can calculate your funding in just a couple of exhibits. What's complicated is both the concept of that shift of accountability from the state to the local level, as well as during this 8-year transition period, understanding how the increases in funding are affecting you. But the formula itself is rather simple. The 8 years I keep talking about, that's a goal of our governor to fully fund the formula within 8 years. There's nothing in statute that guarantees an increase in any fiscal year. What happens is annually, the governor and the legislature determine how much money is available statewide to devote to reaching the goal. Right now, the governor's giving us, or proposing to give us, a lot of money next year. He's doubled what he's proposing to increase funding by. This doesn't mean that 5 years from now, if our state's economy fails to recover, when we have some temporary taxes that expire, when potentially we have a new governor and a new legislature that have different priorities, that funding, that increase will happen. And so that's a necessary point for you to understand, that when we're looking at out years, and in your budget you consider the current and 2 out years, that increase in that out year is not guaranteed. What is guaranteed is that you'll get the level of funding you received the prior year. We're very used to having a COLA kind of guarantee. That no longer exists. This slide shows a really nice illustration, I think, about how local control funding formula is calculated. That every student gets paid a rate the same statewide, depending on your grade level. So every kindergartner in California, that district's going to get paid the same amount. Every 9th through 12th grader, that kid will generate the same amount. That's vastly different from under revenue limits when you each got your own unique rate. Now, on top of that base rate, we add a few things. For kids in kindergarten through 3rd grade, we give you a little bit extra money. That money is for you to fund progression to class sizes of 24:1. That at full implementation of the local control funding formula, you should be operating class sizes averaged at your site level of 24:1, unless you otherwise negotiate a higher amount with your unions. And just a note, I think some of you are already aware, the state board is releasing emergency regulations to talk about how to calculate progress towards 24:1. Because in the interim, until we meet full funding, you have to make progressive progress towards that 24:1. So say you're at 30:1 now, each year, depending on how much funding we receive, you have to make progress. And so we're really excited to know that they're going to be releasing these emergency regulations in draft form, and we'll be able to give you some more specific guidance, because one of the common questions I get is, how do we calculate this? So that's great. We also get additional funding for our kids in grades 9 through 12. That replaces the former CTE, career technical education classes. So all those students, again, generate the same amount. On top of those base rates, districts also receive additional funding for specific identified students. Students that are low income, as determined by your eligibility for free and reduced price meals, your English learners, and your foster youth. The concept there is that districts with those kids will get additional funds because services should be provided to those kids to address their specific needs. And so in the end, a combination of those base grant amounts And for your identified students, gives you your local control funding formula. This slide provides you with all the nitty-gritty details of each one of those. If you notice under the supplemental and concentration grant, districts who have identified students that are more than 55% of their total population do receive additional funding. And so we have found that it is districts who have populations of those identified students above 55% are the ones who, of course, are getting the greatest increases in their revenue. That all leads you again to just calculating your target. As I mentioned earlier, your target is not your funding. So graphically, what this looks like is you start with your prior year. We never move backwards. You are guaranteed to be funded based on your prior year level. It is adjusted by growth or decline, so if you're growing, we'll bump you up a little bit. If you're declining, we'll move it down a little bit. And then we calculate your target. First, we calculate your base and augmentation grants. So your base grants plus your K-3 and 9-12 additional monies. And we add to that your supplemental and concentration grants. So the entirety of that is your target. Again, you're not funded there. The next step is to determine what the difference between those two amounts is. The technical term for this is gap. Fiscal people are not very creative, and when we wanted to know what do we call the gap, we call it the gap. So the difference between your target and your prior year funding is your gap. And if that were fully funded, we'd be at full implementation. So annually, the governor and the legislature appropriate money to help fund that gap. For 14-15, the governor proposes sufficient money to fund 28% of that gap. That number gets a lot of people in trouble because your stakeholders who are less sophisticated than you will believe that you're getting a 28% increase in funding. You are not. You're getting 28% of a gap. And you can see with this illustration how 28% of your gap is not 28% of your funding. And what that actually equates to in your district is really specific to your district. Depends on what your prior year funding looked like, depends on what your population is, what's your unduplicated count. And so whereas before in revenue limit world, we had comparability. We could compare ourselves to our neighbor. We all got a COLA. Today's world, my neighbor might be getting a 12% increase, I might be getting a 3% increase. All based on a 28% gap funding, but remember, that's based on your district and your comparison between current and prior year. So the next big step we have to do is identify what portion of that increase was generated by your unduplicated count. You can see in my illustration that while your unduplicated count might have generated a big amount of money in your target, the funding portion is actually smaller because you're not paid on your target. Like I said, if we were fully funded, this math would be a lot easier. We're not, so we have to determine what piece of that increase was generated by your unduplicated count. We're going to learn a new term. It's called the proportionality percentage. This one I didn't invent. If I had invented it like the gap, I would have called it the increase from your unduplicated count. But this is called the proportionality percentage. Before I move on, I want to talk about a big change in data collection that the local control funding formula is driving. That we're all used to ADA driving our revenue. ADA is audited annually because since it drives revenue, people want to make sure it's right. We're not used to having our CalPADS enrollment data audited. It might have resulted in a little bit of money, but not a substantial amount. It's now going to be audited. We found out yesterday that it is going to be in the emergency regulations for the 2013-14 audit guide. So that means when your auditors perform your 2013-14 audit, they will be examining the enrollment that's driving the unduplicated count. So it's really important that you examine the processes you have in place at your district to make sure that they would withstand audit. Additionally, the county office is now charged with reviewing your CalPADS data. I don't know if you know this, but before CalPADS data went straight from you to the state. County office didn't look at it. We looked at your attendance, but not your enrollment. Now, we're looking at your enrollment. Unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult for us. I don't have historical data. You don't have any audited prior year data. But some of you probably have been contacted by my office to say, you know what, you guys said you were going to have 85%. But when I look at your CalPADS, it's 75%. That's a big deal. Which one's right? So we are contacting you when we notice that there are any differences. Luckily, that's the exception and not the rule. So the funding generated by the unduplicated count, the increase in funds generated by the unduplicated count is a major focus of the eLCAP. You're going to have to demonstrate how you're going to increase or improve services to those students based on the increase in the funding for those services or for those students. Luckily, the definition of the term services is very broad, and you'll find this a common theme throughout LCFF and eLCAP, that the way it's written is to give you as much flexibility as you can have to determine the best use of these funds and in developing your eLCAP. That's where the local control comes in. So although the definition of services specifies specific things, you can say including but not limited to. I love that language, not limited to. So let's talk about how we actually calculate the math here. How do we get to this proportionality percentage? The first thing that's critical to understand, it's based on projections and estimates. Those of you who are used to preparing budgets for districts, no, you prepare your budget on a whole series of projections. First, you have your district projections. You're projecting, what's my enrollment going to be next year? Am I increasing? Am I declining? What's my ADA going to be? Now you're having to determine what's my unduplicated count. Will that proportionality, that percentage, will that change from year to year? You also have all the other budget recommendations that we help you develop. What did the governor propose in January? What did the governor propose in May? I mentioned he's proposing enough money for a 28% gap funding. That can change by the time we get to May. So you have a whole host of estimates used. You need to use those same estimates that you use in your budget to determine the data for your eLCAP. Again, the eLCAP and the budget need to be aligned. But you also need to recognize, and I know the business people know this, these numbers will change. When you develop your eLCAP, the number you get will be different than what you get in July after the state budget is enacted, because the numbers change. There always is a slight shift, and in some years a major shift between what the governor proposes and what's actually enacted. You might project that you're going to have additional students join you, and maybe they don't materialize. Maybe your program to increase attendance wasn't as successful. You're going to have changes. And we're going to talk about how you address the changes, but it's really important for you to know that when you're starting out and you're identifying these numbers, that they are based on projections. Use the best data you have. It's our goal to provide you with the best budget recommendations. Your job is to identify the best ADA projections and enrollment projections that you can. So to start, you need to know what your target is and what your funding is. Our office, as part of the services we provide, is to provide districts with estimates of their LCFF revenue. It's a really dynamic system. How many people have used our revenue projection system? Great. It allows for districts to give us your projections, and we give you back what we think the funding will be. And that system allows you to do that as many times during the day that you want to do. So you can model different scenarios left and right. And then we get into the 8-step calculation of the proportionality percentage. These 8 steps are defined in the State Board of Education regulations. So even if I might think that maybe it's not the most intuitive way to get to the answer, this is the way we get there. I'm going to first walk you through the description of the steps, and then I'm going to show you what the math looks like a little bit. So step one, what are your supplemental and concentration grants at the target? So if we're fully funded, what are they at the target? Number two, this is a critical step. What did you spend in the prior year on your identified students? There have been questions, should I really identify every dollar I spent? Yes, I would think for most districts, whatever programs you operated last year, you're probably still going to operate. You want to take credit for those programs. At minimum, it's your economic impact data, at minimum. But I'm sure every district spent more than their economic impact day on their low-income English learner and foster youth populations. We want to figure out what the difference between those is. What's the difference between your target and your prior year expenditures? And then we want to apply the funding gap percentage to that difference so we can find out what the funded difference between that is. So you spent money on this population last year. What's the funded difference between? And that's really important because I talked earlier about how you have to identify any increase in funding generated by students. That's the increase in funding generated by those students. Item number 4. When you add your prior year expenditures to that increase, you get the total amount of money that you should be spending on these identified students in the current year. You've got your prior year expenditures plus any funded increase. And when you subtract that amount from your total LCFF funding, you get the amount of money that's available for all of your students. So you get a lot of data from this calculation. And number 7, proportionality percentage. I had to say that like 10 times just to be able to spit it out. It's not an easy word. It really represents how much more you should be spending on these identified students than the rest of your students. And you do that by dividing the amount of money we identified that's specifically for these students by the amount of money that's available for all of the students. And that's how we get to the proportionality percentage. When we're at full funding, it's going to be so much easier. We're just going to take our total supplemental concentration grants, divide it by a total funding, we're going to be done. I'm waiting for the next 10 years to pass. Our lives will get a lot simpler. So let's look at what some numbers would really result in. I took a sample district, kind of a largish size, 20,000 ADA, a little bit more than 55% identified students. We've got EIA funding of $2.4 million. I figured that's all they spent. We know you guys really spend more, but let's keep it simple. About $134 million in their funded LCFF. And let's go with the 14-15 gap funding estimate of 28.05%. So for this district, their total supplemental and concentration grants, your slide says S&G, it should be S&C grants, about $19.6 million. Let's subtract the 2.4 in EIA money that they would have had to have spent on these kids, so we get the difference. Remember, that's not funded. We multiply that difference by our gap funding percentage, and we get a funded difference. This is the increase. We'll add that back to that 2.4 million EIA money. We get $7.2 million that should be spent on these identified students. When we subtract it from that 134 total LCFF funding, we get 127 million that's available for all students. So our proportionality percentage, which is 7.2 divided by 127, 5.69%. This district must demonstrate that they did 5.69% more for the identified students. I didn't say spent 5.69% more. I said do. You can identify that quantitatively or qualitatively. You can spend 5.69% more dollars, or you can do 5.69% more stuff. Also note, every dollar you get in LCFF is unrestricted. Every dollar. It's up to you to determine how you spend it. If you want to track a dollar, if you want to track a program, you're going to need to locally define a resource code to do that. It's all unrestricted. It all comes in one lump sum. It's up to you to identify these amounts, and it's up to you for you to define how you're spending them. One of the other big questions I received was, what do I do in July if instead of having 28% of our gap funding, what if through all the budget negotiations they halved that and we only got a 14% gap funding? You've developed an eLCAP assuming you had 28% increase. If you only had a 14%, your line on number 4 would be far less, and that it would affect the rest of your calculation. Statute allows for you to go back and revise your eLCAP. You may want to consider that if there's a material difference. The business folks know that a budget is a living document. It's never set in stone. It's something that's continually evolving throughout the year as the data changes. For your eLCAP, it's quite possible that if we have a material difference in the total amount of funding, you may need to reconsider going back. If you do that, you have to make sure that you go through the steps Karen's going to discuss about disclosure with your stakeholders. However, there's no requirement for the county office to approve a revision after we have approved your initial eLCAP. So if indeed you had this whole host of services you were going to provide because you believed you had $7 million and you end up only $4 million, obviously you can't provide all the services. You have an opportunity to go back and reevaluate. So some things that are really important to remember. You will never get less than what you received in the prior year. Adjusted for growth and decline. If you're in decline, you're going to have a lower starting point, right? If you're growing, luckily they'll give you more automatically. So even should our economy not recover as quickly as we want it to, we will never get less than we got the year before. And those of us who have lived through the last 5 years know that that's a nice thing to know. Because indeed, we have gotten a lot less than what we've gotten the prior years. But any increase is not guaranteed. Unlike the days where you could depend on a COLA, you cannot depend on a COLA. It is always our basis for budget recommendations to go with what the governor proposed. So in January, when the governor released his proposal, we'll say, yes, let's budget that. But for instance, for 15-16, we won't know what he proposes until January 2015. So we're going to say, don't budget any increase, or if you do, reserve it. Your total revenues will fluctuate. Budget folks know this. They know that the final calculation of a district's revenue is not made until 18 months after the start of the school year. 18 months. So you're going to start your school year July 1st, 2014. In February 2016 will be the final apportionment for the 14-15 year. So you're going to have fluctuations. Good news is as the year goes on, you have less fluctuations. But initially, you might have some pretty severe fluctuations. And your full implementation will happen at minimum over an 8-year period. So lots of information for you. I would love to answer questions now. If you'd have a question, please approach the microphone, and I can do my very best. Don't be shy. Connie, can you come up to the mic so we can, the reason we have the microphone set up is so that we can share the questions with our webcast audience.
Marlene, you mentioned that the audit guideline, and I want clarification because you know that most of the years already passed. So if there's a new audit guide come out for this year, and how we adjust the new audit guideline, because if there's any changes, you know, if we change from now on, were there any audit finding because we already do the business in the older way?
Yeah, you're right, Connie. The state and the Education Audit Appeals Panel tries very hard to release the audit guidelines for a year before that year starts, so that you know what rules you're operating under. The only time they make a change to those audit guidelines is when the change is material and when it can affect your funding. In this case, an examination of your CalPADS data is material and it affects your funding. So in this case, The state is basically saying you've known since the beginning of the year that your funding is based on enrollment. It's critical. We're going to look at it. It is difficult if you hadn't prepared, and so that's why I recommend that now you go back and reevaluate those processes. This is data that we've not looked at really closely before, so you might have some things that are perhaps needing a little bit of cleaning up, so now you have an opportunity to go back and make sure that you've got a process that's good and in place.
I got 2 questions. Regarding the CSR, you didn't mention anything about having a bargaining unit, contract that says something different. Is that still going to apply, or 24-to-1 no matter what?
It absolutely does apply. The rule is that at full implementation, you need to be operating class sizes in grades K through 3 at the site level of 24-to-1. There is an exception, and that exception is if you have a collective bargaining agreement that allows you to operate higher class sizes. It was the CDE's opinion that any reference to class sizes was sufficient to say, yes, you have agreed. So a standard agreement many of you already have is that you're going to have class sizes, say, of 30-to-1, just in general. I think now that we know that we're going to see some State Board of Education regulations, we'll have that confirmed. Okay. The CDE was always very careful to say that they can't define law more strictly than what it states in statute. So we'll find out if indeed that broad language works, or whether a requirement to have specific language addressing K3 class sizes. So we might see something like that, but I'm not sure. I haven't seen the language yet.
The concern is that we're going to lose funding if we don't make the progress. That's the concern. And then the other question was regarding audit guidelines. I read it from School Services the other day about the additional, some of the guidelines, but any mention about free and reduced lunch and auditing of CalPADS data? What do we do there if they start looking into, applications and things like that, if they talk to you guys at all?
Yes, actually the CDE shared the language that's going to be going into the audit guidelines for the current year. And what it directs your auditor to do is to review your enrollment that's tied to free and reduced price meal eligibility. And if that eligibility was determined on something other than submission of the federal form, to make sure that you had the correct annual collection of data from that specific family. So that is part of it. Another part of it is to look at your students who are classified by virtue of being English learners and to see what kind of documentation you have to support that. Like any other audit, they're not going to come out and look at everybody. They're going to pick a school site, they're going to pick a few students, they're going to look at those students. If they find problems with that data, then they expand the review. If they don't find any problems with that sample, then they're done. So now's an opportunity for you to go back and make sure that you have documents in the right place, in the right file drawer, and that you're ready to go. I believe that the guidelines are not posted on the web yet, but as soon as they are, we will be emailing out a link to that website to all of our districts so that you'll have an opportunity to review it.
Marlene, I was wondering if you could go back to the sample proportionality percentage slide.
Sure.
On that calculation, the 5.69, my understanding, I could be incorrect, that's 5.69 of your new funding, is that right?
That's correct. What that calculation is line 5 divided by line 6. So the funds that are for your identified students, and we got there by saying this is what we spent on those identified students the prior year, plus the increase in the current year, right? So the funds that are for those identified students divided by the funds that are available for all of our students. And so that's what that reflects. Your eLCAP, you're going to have to know both things. You're going to need to know the increase as well as the proportionality percentage. So increase is just that, just the increase generated by those students, and then the amount that you should be spending for all of your identified students in addition to all of your students. Go ahead.
Okay. With the proportionality percentage, it says you have to provide that much more in services. How do you quantify? I mean, do you just quantify it by spending the dollars? Because if you're a statewide district, you're equally educating all of your children is the intent of it, correct? And you're spending all of your dollars on those populations, so you must be satisfying the requirement. Is there more to satisfying that proportionality percentage? Because it really doesn't talk about dollars, it says services. And how do you...
You're absolutely correct. It's a really good observation. And my answer is all of the above. It's entirely up to you to determine what services you're providing and how you're describing those, and whether you're using a quantitative measurement dollars or a qualitative description. And you all are also right. Karen's going to talk a little bit in her presentation about some thresholds for providing district level and site level services. From my understanding, the higher percentage you have, the closer you get to 100% identified students, the easier this process becomes, because basically if you serve all your students, you're serving your population, and that anything less than that really highly identified number becomes more problematic. But in the end, and you're going to hear us say this a lot, that's up to you to decide. This is local control, and it's about more than just identifying your district's priorities. It's about identifying how you want to discuss that with your community.
Or LCAP.
Because that's the other piece of it. All this information we're sharing, you're going to end up having to share with your stakeholders, and you're going to want to make these decisions with that in mind as well. What will help them satisfy their interests as well.
Okay. One more question. If the state ever deficits our funding, then what happens to our proportionality?
You know, I remember when I first started with LACO, which, believe it or not, was almost 19 years ago. And we were recovering from a revenue limit deficit back then. I think the year we got it paid back, we all got like a nice 11% bump in funding. And the discussion was how that was never going to happen again and how that was so horrible. And here we are, coming out of a 22% deficit. And like I mentioned, the plan is to have full funding within 8 years, which really brings us back to that pre-deficited level. There is a lot of what-ifs between now and the next 8 years. And that's why we're always recommending caution when dealing with a future year. We have some temporary tax increases that are set to expire in 2016 and 2018. Hopefully our economic recovery can hold. But there's a lot of what-ifs. And there's always the possibility, if we have another recession, that we have a cut in funding. But that's way too much what-ifs. And let's not be pessimistic. Let's be happy.
You said that we're always funded on the prior year. We're saying 12-13 was our base year, but does the prior year start in year 8? Or are we always
Colette's question was, we're always funded on the prior year. Does that mean 12-13? What it means is the prior year. That with local control funding formula, we start off with 12-13 as we're calling it the hold harmless year, right? And then for 13-14, we add that to our gap funding. That becomes our new prior year. So the prior year is always just the prior year, which is a result, if you wanted to go back all the way to 12-13. Any deficit would require a specific law to be passed by the legislature and approved by the governor. I think that's doubtful for the next few years for that to happen. So even if we see not a implementation over the course of 8 years, I don't think it's likely that we're going to receive any funding. But I'm so used to being cautious that it's borders on pessimism. Are there any more questions before we move on? We have a lot more information, all specifically about the eLCAP.
So with the, we're using EIA expenditures as a baseline for supplemental and concentration to determine that amount. What about any carryover from prior years? How does that affect, I mean, we're using EIA as the baseline. How, if we had a carryover that are carrying over into 13-14 or the next year, how does that come into effect?
Well, let me first clarify that we're using EIA as a minimum amount you spent for these kids in the prior year. So the minimum the state says that you would have spent on these identified students was your economic impact aid. What you really should be doing is looking at those services you provided exclusively for your low-income English learners and foster youth and developing a number that is at least EIA. The second part of your question is, what do we do with carryover from the old state categorical programs? It depends. Many of the categorical programs that have been absorbed by the LCFF were already flexed, meaning that although way back in 2007-8 they had some restrictions as part of giving districts tools to meet some of the challenges presented by our deficit, the state said do whatever you want with them. So if it was flexed, a tier 3 categorical program, there's no carryover, it was unrestricted money. The state has told us, however, that if it was a restricted program, you should account for the carryover as the restricted program. So if you had a restricted program, that you still have a balance of. You haven't spent all the money. You should, in the current year, still identify it by the restricted resource and spend it for the same purposes. So if you have any balances, you should still spend it for the same purposes. Speaking of object code, I believe I mentioned that all LCFF goes into object code 8011, 0000 resource. Please keep that in mind as you're doing budget adjustments, that if you still have money, current year money, that you haven't moved over yet, move it over.
Hi, Marlene. We go to the EIA 1213 benchmark, the dollar amount that you're going to spend. Based on the school services and LACO calculation, you assume 100% based on the award amount. That's how the calculation come about. But what's interesting is in the 13-14, the current year, even though there's no eLCAP requirement, the targeted for the school service, the supplemental concentration, is really based on whatever the targeted time the LCFF funding gap in current year is 11.78%. In 14-15, if you're really thinking about it, since mid of January, the changes has made was you add whatever the EIA multiplied by 1 minus the LCFF funding gap. So in 14-15 is 28.05%. You still get the answer what you show up there. So they are exactly like that. But I guess my question is, what changes since mid of January? Because now you add the EIA formula involved with the in the LCAP dollar amount there.
What changed was the adoption of the State Board of Education regulations. These steps 1 through 8, are specifically enumerated in the regulations. And so we're just following that math. And your point that 2013-14 hasn't been finished is correct. You know, we haven't even seen how the state's going to actually calculate it. You know, we've worked it as a giant word problem. Let's go from the statute and figure out the math. But there are a few unknowns. Budget people are used to having these numbers kind of rolling forward and having a little bit of uncertainty. But for 13-14, the numbers are pretty firm. That budget has been enacted. We know the math. The 11, just short of 12% is a good number. I know there are some differences between the way school services looks at the math and we look at the math. Our projections are aligned with the FICMAC calculator, which is another tool for you. So running your numbers through either our tool or the FICMAC calculator should get you to the same point. We have time for just one last question before we move on. Fantastic. Well, I'd like to introduce Karen Ryback next, and she's going to walk you through the Local Control Accountability Plan.
Oh, thank you. By the way, if you left keys in the restroom, women's restroom, you'll pick them up downstairs at the reception desk. My name is Karen Ryback, and I am the project director for the categorical programs here at LACO. And I'm going to be walking you through today the local control and accountability plan and the process for the development of that. In January, the State Board of Ed passed emergency regulations for the template. The template is now posted on the CDE website, and we've provided in your packet, the blue pages, the actual template. It's posted as a Word document. Within the template itself, it includes instructions, and districts will want to follow those instructions. It also includes guiding questions. And while those are sort of prompts to sort of help you complete your eLCAP, you are not required to answer all of those questions. Additionally, there is any reference that you make in your eLCAP to data, it must be consistent with your school accountability report card. I'm going to walk you through the template now. The template has 3 major sections to it. Section 1 is the stakeholder engagement. This is really pretty straightforward and the easiest section of your eLCAP to complete, although I will say that the process for engaging your stakeholders may or may not be quite as easy. You have to ensure that you are consulting with your stakeholders in a timely manner to allow them to provide you with some feedback and input into the eLCAP itself. What districts are being asked to complete here is simply two things. A description of how did you involve your stakeholders in this process, and two, that involvement, how did it impact the development of your eLCAP? So as I said, pretty straightforward. And you'll find that on page 10 in the template. So who do you need to involve? Well, the legislation is actually very specific about who needs to be involved. They specify teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, pupils, parents, and also Senate Bill 97 added on collective bargaining units. So, and I should note that last one, the bargaining units, does not apply to charter schools. So charter schools in the room, that does not apply to you. So many of you subscribe to school services and may have seen this. We thought it was worth sort of just highlighting for a moment what the definition of consult is. And so knowing that this free exchange of information, opinions, and so forth is not subject to negotiations. And certainly that districts have the fundamental management rights to establish educational policies and goals, objectives, determine curriculum, establishing budget priorities, and allocating funds. However, in your eLCAPs, if you do address activities or services that impact hours of employment or compensation for professional development, for example, then certainly those things would be subject to negotiation. In addition to the stakeholders needing to be involved in this process, the legislation adds on 2 district-level advisory committees. One is the Parent Advisory Committee, or what we're calling the PAC. And that committee needs to have representation of parents of students who are low income, foster youth, and English learners. There really isn't much else. We'll talk a little bit about a bit more about it, but there really isn't a lot of anything else, dealing with the size or how many or how they get selected to be on this committee. So right now it's pretty wide open. And the second committee is your English Learner Advisory Committee. And again, these both are district level committees. Most of you have something that looks very much like this District Advisory Committee, the EL, Parent Advisory Committee. It's your DLACs. And so if you have DLACs, don't dismantle them. You've already got a group that sort of meets this requirement. I should note here that those districts who have EIA carryover, you need to be making sure that you're using the rules. So your EIA funds, if you're using them as state compensatory ed, EIA, state comp ed, then you are expected to continue to have school advisory committees and a district advisory committee. Is there a question? No, okay. And likewise, if you have carryover this year, you are expected to continue to have your ELACs and your DLACs. Yes. It's okay. Clarification. The question is, when we talk about ensuring that our committees include the right representation of parents, when we get to the ensuring that parents of low income there's representation there, how do you go about doing that? And that kind of a sensitive issue. And I don't have an answer for you right now because I agree that is a sensitive issue. So we're going to have to give that some thought. Yeah, good question. Thank you. The reason why we want parents, obviously, representing those students is because LCFF set up these categories of students as being called out for your supplemental concentration grants. So the legislation itself actually includes a definition of each one of those student groups. Of course, you do have other groups of students, and we don't want to forget about them. You have your racial ethnic subgroups, and there are, in addition, students with disabilities. It was interesting that in the legislation, it sort of made reference to that the API accountability with regards to your subgroups and the definition of what constitutes numerically significant was really significantly decreased from 100 students constituting a significant, numerically significant subgroup down to 30 students now designating a subgroup as numerically significant, and even further for foster youth at the count of 15 students. So something to keep in mind. That takes us through section 1. Like I said, kind of deceivingly easy. The real work is actually meeting with those folks and getting that meaningful input and dialogue going with them. We're moving on now to section 2, where the district will establish what their goals are and their progress indicators. So if you turn to page 12, you'll be looking at the template that I have up on the screen right now. There are several columns that districts will need to complete in this section, beginning with, over here, the identified need and metric over there on the left-hand side. So what established that need? What data were you looking at that led to you developing that goal? And what metric will you use to measure progress towards that goal? Next, you'll actually be describing what that goal is. And districts need to be thinking about, do we want goals for all students? Do we want goals for subgroups? Do we want goals for each and every one of the state priorities? And that will be determined by you and the local context in your district. I will tell you that one of our recommendations to you is to consider establishing goals for all students and differentiating the support for your subgroups through the services and the actions in your plan. So something for consideration. Our recommendation is that you consider establishing goals for all students rather than different goals for different subgroups, and then distinguish the differentiated supports for the different groups of students through your actions and your services, which will be addressed in the next section. Does that make sense? Great. But if you do happen to have a subgroup that you do want to call out, there is a column where you can identify for a specific subgroup, or you can simply say all students. Additionally, if you're a unified school district and you have different grade spans, you may want to have separate goals for your elementary schools and other goals for your secondary schools, and that's perfectly okay to do. Next section right here, the annual update, analysis of progress. You won't be completing until a year later, where you reflect back on were we successful and how'd we do. The next column talks about what will be different, and this is where you're going to, by using your metric, sort of write down what the anticipated improvement that you expect to see for each year. And then finally, you're going to indicate what state priorities are related to that goal. So that's the layout there. The one thing to be thinking about is, do you want to create a goal for each state priority, or do you want to perhaps establish goals that are sort of more encompassing and address multiple priorities? Either way is fine to do. Think about the metrics that you'll be measuring your progress. In some areas of the state priorities, they actually mandate certain metrics that you'll have to use. For example, under pupil achievement, under student engagement, and under school climate as examples. Charter schools. Charter schools, if you are new and bringing forth a petition, it is expected that state priorities will be included in your charter petition, or charters who are renewing ought to be including those in their charter. In the law, it states that on or before July 1st, 2015, and each year thereafter, charter schools will be updating their goals. So here are the state priorities. If you're a quick counter, you'll see that there are more than 8 up here, and that's because the county office owns the 2 in the upper corners. County offices, in addition to all the other priorities that all districts and charters will be writing to, are going to be addressing expelled youth and foster youth as well. At the State Board Ed meeting, Sue Burr sort of threw out these sort of grouping the state priorities in these categories, kind of an easier way to think about it. And districts started thinking, well, that might be a good way for us to organize our goals around, rather than writing a goal for each priority. Maybe think of them in these terms. So conditions for learning, pupil outcomes, and engagement, which would include engaging parents as well as pupils and teachers. So I'm going to kind of go through these quick. I'm sure everyone's pretty familiar with the state priorities, but the very first one is really the conditions for learning, or the basic services. Those districts that participate in Williams monitoring are well familiar. We're looking at our teachers fully credentialed and appropriately assigned. Our students, do they have access to standards aligned materials, and are the facilities in good working order? Priority 2 is really all about your implementation of Common Core standards and equal access for your English learners to those Common Core. Priority number 7 addresses course access. And the Ed Code sections in this part really refer to the mandated subject areas that districts are required to teach for grades 1 through 6, and then secondary. So that's what that's referring to. Oops, and there's the 2 priorities for the county office. Priority number 4 is really about student achievement, and so again, the metrics that are here, those that are applicable and still in operation, are ones that you will be required to address in your eLCAP. This relates back to that course access and looking at what are outcomes in those subject areas for which you are required to provide instruction. And priority number 3 speaks to parent engagement. This is not necessarily related to the stakeholder engagement that you had in going through this development of the eLCAP process, but it's really the ongoing involvement of parents at both the school level and the district level, and making sure that districts are really trying to promote the participation of our parents who have students that fall into those unduplicated categories. Yes, Gary.
On page 14, that very last slide of people outcomes, people achievement, it identifies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118, 119, 120 3, 4 bullets, share of pupils. Can you explain that?
It really means, the question had to do with the language used in the template, and it really is speaking to, when it says rate, it really means the percentage of students is really what it's saying. Priority 5 is talking about pupil engagement, so we're really looking at attendance and absenteeism, dropouts, graduation rates. School climate addresses suspensions, expulsions, and really looks at this sense of safety, school connectedness, not only for students, but for parents and teachers as well. So that's section 2. You're establishing your goals and identifying what metrics will you begin to monitor your progress by. Moving into section 3. Section 3 is probably going to be the most involved section, and in fact, it's broken up into 4 parts, and we'll look at each of those parts. You'll see that it starts again with the goals and the related state and local priorities, because we're wanting to make sure that we're linking whatever actions or services that will be provided, that we're linking those back directly to the goals we've established in section 2. So here we're going to be listing the actions and services for our students that will allow you to meet the goals you've established. So think about this first section, 3A is what I'm calling it, as your core program for all students. Things that you might want to consider including there are high quality teachers, appropriately assigned, instructional materials, good working facilities, the things that we ensure that all students are provided for. There is a column there called level of service, and for the most part, you'll probably, I'm thinking, you'll be marking that that's district-wide. You know, these are services that we provide district-wide for all of our students. Again, there's a spot there for an annual update that you will be doing a year from now. And then you're going to be indicating what are the related expenditures associated with that action or that service, and when will they occur, in year 1, year 2, or year 3. Now, what a lot of people are thinking about, if I'm guessing correctly, is how big is this plan going to be? And the answer to that is as big as you want it to be. Okay? So it's all going to hinge on how many goals are you putting into your plan. No one's dictating how many goals you have. The only thing that you have to do is address all 8, or for the county office, 10 state priorities. Okay? It will hinge on how many actions and services are you putting into the plan. We know that some districts plan on putting a lot. In fact, they plan on putting not just their state funds in, but federal funds, because it tells the whole story. But they're doing that because that's the context of their local district and their stakeholders. Other districts will take a different approach, and that's okay. Now, when we look at part 3B, it looks exactly the same. And so in A, where we're describing what we're doing for all students, part B, we're now describing what additional actions or services we'll be providing to support our unduplicated students, along with our redesignated fluent English proficient students, to ensure that they meet the standards you set and that you're providing supports to meet your established goals. Does that make sense? So both A and B of Section 3, you're going to be asked to include expenditures, and those should be classified using the object code in the California School Accounting Manual. You'll also need to be indicating your funding sources. So again, for most folks, that will be LCFF funds. Some districts may want to specify, especially in Section 3B, where we're talking about our services for our students, they may want to specify these funds as supplemental concentration grant funds. They may want to use a local determined object code to track the funds that are being spent on unduplicated students. So there's a lot of different ways to slice it, and you're going to have to figure out how it works best for you. Section 3, Part B, also speaks about level of service. In Part A, it doesn't, in Part A, you're probably writing district-wide, and that's perfectly fine. But in Part B, you're going to be asked also funds in a district-wide manner, in a school-wide manner, for the county, in a county-wide manner, or for a charter school, a charter-wide manner. So what does that really mean? It means that the funds that have been designated as concentration supplemental grant funds for that are meant to provide services to your unduplicated students, that you are selecting to use those funds. If you're providing a service sort of from the district, you're doing it for all students, not just for your unduplicated students. That's what district-wide means. If you're a district that has high numbers of those kids, it makes sense to maybe do it in a district-wide manner. Or if you're allocating the funds out to schools and you have high numbers of those students at the schools, it makes sense to use it in a school-wide manner, especially if those schools might be operating Title I school-wide programs. But if you're a district that doesn't have high numbers, it might not make sense to use it district-wide or school-wide. So what you would be doing is targeting those services and actions to the targeted students. Now we'll be talking about this again because this is going to come up as to an extra step you're going to need to do. In the template, in parts 3C, and you'll find that, it's simply just a text box, which is why I didn't put a picture of it up on the slide. So you'll find that at the bottom of page 15, move to 16. It's nothing but an open text box. So what do you put in there? Well, it's asking for three things, districts to complete three things. It's asking for you to identify the amount of funds that have been calculated on the basis of your supplemental concentration grant based on your unduplicated students. That's one thing, just how much, what is that amount of funds? Number two, it's asking you to describe how you're expending these funds. Well, didn't we just do that in the prior section? So you might want to reference what those services were in that prior section. And then finally, it's asking you that if you chose to use the funds in a district-wide or school-wide manner, that you provide an explanation of why you wanted to do that. And so you might say, well, because we have 90% of our kids that fall into those categories, and it makes sense for our district to do that. And there's a whole lot of words on this, but I'll get to the point very quickly, and that is, if you are a district that has less than 55% of your students that fall into that unduplicated pupil count, then you have an extra step to do. Not only do you have to say why you chose to use it school-wide or district-wide, but you have to say why that is the best and most effective way to use the funds. Same thing for school-wide. If you have less than 40% at the school level of unduplicated students, then you will be doing this extra step of why you think that's the most effective way to do it. In Part D, last part of Section 3, you're being asked to do two things. One is, and I'm going to start with the second bullet, you're being asked to do exactly what Marlene walked you through. Identify what is that proportionality, what is that percentage of that you have to show that students are receiving, your unduplicated students are receiving above and beyond what other kids are receiving. The second one, which is really the first bullet, is really about, so what are those services? So this is where you might write, you know, we provide so many counselors at the high school level for all students. We are providing an additional counselor who will focus on the needs of our unduplicated students. And then whatever services you are, just need to match that proportion. So that is one example. You are required to do an annual update. You'll be looking to see how well you did, changes accordingly. You do have some other plans, and I just want to make a quick note right now about how those other plans tie to your eLCAP. Do, however, think about your eLCAP as a comprehensive planning tool. And again, it can be as big or as little as you make it. Some districts may want to make reference to activities, services that are described in other plans. You're welcome to do that. In your annual update or in your initial one, you may supplement it with information from other plans, such as your LEA plan. Does this take the place of your LEA plan? The answer is no. Your LEA plan is a requirement for federal funding, and that's what it describes. Federal funding is the LEA plan. Your eLCAP is describing state funding. Those districts that are in program improvement, you still have to follow whatever those planning requirements are. School sites, how does this affect school sites? Well, the legislation says that whatever activities or services you write into your eLCAP, those should be reflected in school plans. It's not saying that the goals and everything else, but the actions and the services should be reflected. Who approves those site plans? Your local governing boards. So they should be ensuring that there is some alignment between the services in the eLCAP and the services in the school plans. Finally, the adoption process. I know I'm going fast, but we have more to share. Very quickly here at the district level, you're consulting, step 1, step 2. You have those 2 advisory committees. What I need to share very quickly with you here is that it requires that the superintendent of each district present the eLCAP to those 2 advisory committees for comment and review, and whatever comments or questions they have, the superintendent is required to respond in writing to those comments. You have to have a public notice to submit written comments and a public hearing, and then you adopt the plan concurrently with your budget. It's submitted to the county office, and we'll be talking about that process in just a moment. It's posted on your website, and we'll post a link to it on our website. Charter schools, similar, except for they don't have the middle steps in there. They don't have the advisory committees and the public hearing. Also, very quickly, charter schools, you are not submitting it to the county for approval. You're getting your approval from your local governing board and giving your authorizer a copy. County offices, very similar, except for county offices, we're submitting our eLCAP to the state. I'm going to invite Marlene back up because she's going to talk to you a little bit more about some of these timelines with the budget.
Am I on? Terrific. Everybody can hear me all right? Great. Great. So obviously there's a link between the county office's AB 1200 duties and eLCAP approval. I mentioned earlier our eLCAP and our budget, they're like conjoined twins. You can't separate them. And so that means the county office review processes are very similarly intertwined. What LCFF doesn't do is it doesn't change the AB 1200 responsibilities. It adds to it. You kind of should be glad you're not me. We still have responsibility to review your budget, your first interim, your second interim, and any other major changes to your budget throughout the year to determine your fiscal solvency. That doesn't go away. We now have a few extra processes. I mentioned CalPAD's review, and now we have the eLCAP review. I want to point out the bottom two squares on the slide because this is really important. Districts are very used to having at one meeting a public hearing on their budget followed immediately by board adoption of the budget. How many people here have one meeting for that process? How many do you have to have now? Two. You have to have one meeting at which your eLCAP and your budget both are disclosed during a public hearing, eLCAP first, budget second, same meeting, at a subsequent meeting. Not on the same day. You can't close a meeting and open another meeting. Not on the same day. You have to have board adoption first of your eLCAP and then of your budget. The timing is not accidental. Your eLCAP's driving your budget, right? Your eLCAP contains your goals, contains your services, describes what you're doing. That drives your budget. So, statute says separate meeting, so that's why you say separate day. I know that this year your board calendars are quite likely set. I recommend that if you typically only have one meeting in June, you ask your board to have another meeting in June. It'd be very difficult to have to accomplish the public hearing in May and adoption in June because that means your staff has one less month to do your budget. They can't do this with one less month. They need that month. I also recommend that as you move forward, you build into your calendar 2 meetings in June forevermore. That you really need to have this as part of the expectation. That your board is now intimately involved in the creation of your eLCAP and your budget, and that your board meeting should reflect that. So this year, we had some unique challenges simply because of the timing. That we had at the beginning of the year, the enactment of the budget, the enactment of AB 97 and SB 97, that was the implementing legislation and the cleanup legislation for LCFF. That required the State Board of Education to adopt regulations. And we all know that the State Board of Education just now adopted regulations, which, believe it or not, was ahead of schedule. This eLCAP template you have, we had the potential of not looking at until later in March. So we should all, write a letter to the State Board and say, thank you very much. That still means we have a very short period of time in which to do what you need to do. Karen described for you how you're going to identify the metrics that you're going to use to evaluate your success at meeting your stated goals. Eventually, the county office is also going to have to review your progress. We will know how we do that when the State Board adopts their rubric in October 2015. So we don't know how we're going to do the next step. Overall, LCFF and eLCAP is an evolving system. It's an evolving progress. I think most of us know that there's still a level of controversy over some of the regulations, and I think we can expect to see cleanup legislation, changes in the final regulations. So just anticipate that the information we share with you today will evolve. It will change. So a sample 12-month planning. And of course, this was difficult to do this year since we didn't have all the information, but really, as you're going through the process this year, you should be anticipating what you're going to be doing next year. that even though the LCAP submission to the county office is annually, this is an ongoing process really for you and your district. So at the beginning of the year, you're assessing and engaging, you're moving into drafting and that consultation period. You're sharing and responding, and finally get to the end of the year, we're deciding and adopting. This year, we're just going to do it a lot more quickly. We'll be really, really, really efficient. And again, a slightly different representation of the same thing. Overall, I think if you share these timelines with your stakeholders, it will be helpful. It will be helpful for them to understand that we didn't have the template until just recently, so that'll help you explain why the engagement didn't occur sooner. And then again, next year, anticipate that this is a year-long process. This is not something you do at the end of the year. Again, going back to budget, we adopt a budget by July 1st. We revisit that budget continuously. That there's never a date where we go, okay, we adopted it, we're fine, and next year we'll develop our next year's budget. LCAP's going to be kind of similar to that. You know, you're going to need to keep a handle on what you've decided for the current year's LCAP and what your update's going to look like next year, and to not be surprised when you do that self-evaluation on where you are. This is really critical. Normally, when we review your budget and we decide to do one of three things. We either approve it if it looks great or mostly great. We disapprove it if it has significant failures, or we do something called a conditional approval when it looks mostly good. But we can give you a little bit of time until September to give us a response. With LCAP, we may not approve your budget until your LCAP is approved. I'll say it again. I cannot approve your budget until your LCAP is approved. So that means that if there is, say, a missing component in your LCAP, your budget will be disapproved. When your budget is disapproved, you must submit a new budget by September 9th. That new budget has to be board adopted, has to be disclosed locally, and follow all the same procedures as a regular budget. Nobody wants to have to do two budgets. So we really want to make sure that this LCAP approval goes through. And I think most of you who submit your budgets to me know that that process works best when we're not surprised. We have an awful lot of conversations with you prior to budget submittal. And I think the same thing is true for the LCAP. That working this process in a partnership will allow us to reach a point where approval is the natural course of events. The other issues we need to talk about also is that we are reviewing your LCAP to make sure that you did identify the increase in the funds generated by the identified students. That is something we're going to confirm. Luckily, we have a system where we share projections with you. And so if we are both using the same projection, the same system, we're going to be in agreement. If you disagree with the tools we provide to help you identify that dollar amount, let's have that conversation sooner rather than later, so that we know if we have a disagreement and we have a different number, that that's not going to be the cog that jams up this machine. In addition, remember that you do have a couple of maintenance of effort requirements. Even though ROP funds have been absorbed by the LCFF, they no longer exist. You do have a requirement to spend the same amount in the current year as you did in the prior year. That's still true. And we do know that the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, the role that they're going to play in the assessment of your LCAPs is on ongoing development. Next, we have a further discussion of the county office approval, and I'm going to invite Yolanda back to discuss that with you.
In the program part, you really didn't have an opportunity to ask questions. So we're going to go through a little bit more and then be able to open it up for questions on the program part. As Karen had said, how big this LCAP is or how small, it's totally up to you. Now, something we had put in the package was a guidelines that we thought for you just to consider. Some people were telling me, well, we want to do 5 goals for every for all students, and that's 5 goals for 8 priorities plus all your subgroups. And I said, well, that's great, but think about it, because nothing says that you have to do that. Really concentrate on what is the focus that you want to place for this first year. In terms of the approval process for the county schools, as Marlene said, you're going to do your eLCAP and your budget. Within 5 days after approval, you're going to send it to the county office. Budget goes to Marlene. The eLCAP will go over to Olivia Fuentes' office. Okay? Then we'll start going through the process of reviewing. Now, although the Ed Code gave us timelines in which we ask you for clarification, you have 15 days to answer us. We have 15 days to then remark or add information. And any of the county office's recommendations need to be heard in public, in a public meeting, which is your board meeting, to say, well, LACO thought that on our priority number 1 on language arts, they felt we needed to do the following things. Okay, that has to be done in a public board meeting. Okay, we have all the confidence in you that on this first round, remember it's baseline, and although we have until October 8th to approve, we know that your budget can't be approved unless we approve on the program side. And we are going to be following the same pattern as the budget division. So the eLCAPs, as soon as they're approved, the budget people will know, and so we're going to be in tandem. So we're not going to, obviously, whoever wrote this didn't realize the fiscal cycle and calendar on it. Now let's talk about what happens in year 2, okay? On year 2, you're going to be looking at your goals. You're going to be revising them. You're going to be looking at your actions and expenditures. Just like your budget is a living document and your budget's changing, your eLCAP's going to do the same thing, but you're not going to have to send it to us. So let's say in the middle of the year, there's a change in your budget and your services to a group of children is going to change. You have that information probably for your stakeholders, so you don't surprise them at the end of the year when you start your new eLCAP, but we don't need that in the program side. You don't have to report that to us. Our responsibility on this first round is, 1, did you follow the template? 2, did you address the 8 priorities? And that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, the budget people, and we will look at also, is the expenditures. Is there significant, sufficient dollars to do the services you're going to put in for your priorities, for your goals? We will be looking at that. Again, this is second year. At second year, the county has to provide technical assistance if the eLCAP is not approved. And once the State Board of Education does the rubric of how to evaluate second, third year out, we will be looking at if you didn't meet your priorities and or growth in the subgroups, and upon the request of the district. Now, also, the technical assistance from the county will be content experts, team of content experts to help you in terms of the growth in your students or subgroups. Also, we're able to ask for the state superintendent to assign you as a district to the California Collaborative for Education educational excellence. Okay, that group is yet to be evolved. But if you are assigned to them, they have the authority to do experts to help you identify the need, help you design the services for those children, and you as a district will have to pay for the services. There is some resources that we added in your packet that you may want to see that have some of these areas that we thought were really helpful. The recommendation from the people going to the State Board of Education gave many ideas to the State Board, and we're hoping they take some of those recommendations. And one of the recommendations was to develop electronic eLCAP. And we're going to get to that, and which will be the ending of our segment. But we want to give some opportunity right now for any questions on the program side of the eLCAP. Could you come, because we are on the, doing a webcast?
Is there any guidance on what services you should count towards supplemental and concentration for students with disabilities? With our SPED encroachment being so high, you could almost say everything goes for those students. Is there any kind of guidance on what should or shouldn't be?
It's really going to be up to you to decide that. You're absolutely right. I mean, it could take up a lot of your LCFF funds. So you're just going to establish in Section 3A what those services are for those students.
I would add to that question for special education too. You still, many of you are used to revenue limits where you do the revenue limit transfer. You may do an LCFF transfer. So, but that transfer conceptually would likely be under the LCFF portion available to serve all students, unless you specifically identify those students as meeting one of the 3 criteria. But you may still do a special education transfer.
I wanted to go back to section 1 about stakeholders, and you mentioned charter schools don't have to consult with bargaining units. What about charter schools where their teachers have unionized and have, worked with UTLA? Would you then need to consult with them, and then are you obligated to negotiate with them as well?
The legislation does not require the legislation for eLCAP does not require that, and that was done through Senate Bill 97, and it doesn't apply to charters.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, now it's my real pleasure to introduce Mr. Linder is our Chief Technology Officer, who brought the whole idea of the electronic eLCAP.
Thank you, Yolanda. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to take a minute and give some background on the system we're about to show you. LACO has developed and had in production over the last 5 or 6 years a technology plan builder system. And so with the advent of LCFF and eLCAP plan, we had the idea that let's use that system we already have developed as a core design to do eLCAPs online. And so that's what we've done. With the support of our superintendent, Dr. Delgado, we're going to make the system available statewide for other county offices, obviously for our own districts to use, but also for other county offices. And we believe we'll be able to do it on an ongoing basis. We may have to revisit that if support and maintenance is excessive, but we think we can do that. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Olivia Fuentes to actually show you the system that we've developed.
Thank you, Greg. I'm Olivia Fuentes, and I'm the Division Director for Accountability, Support, and Monitoring. And I'm going to be demoing the online eLCAP. And if you notice, it's great that they left this slide up here because I want to give you a little background. One of the state board members requested the creation of an online electronic template. They said, go ahead, produce it. So many of you who have had the pleasure of working with CDE know that when you address some of these issues with CDE, it takes a long time. And one of the responses that came from CDE staff was, that will happen in a year and a half. So I want to really recognize our tech team, our fabulous tech team, that from the publication of the template and the approval of the template in January, we are now almost at the end of February. We do have an online template. And we know that we haven't heard of any other online templates that are really ready to go live. And some of you are asking, well, when do I have access to it? We will give you access to it after this demo. For technological purposes, we just wanted to make sure there were no glitches, and we know that we're videotaping live. So just wanted to give you that background. In terms of that, I do want to point out that you do have the web address. So for those of you who want to know, how do I get it? Behind your PowerPoint is a one-sheet page, and you have towards the bottom half, it gives you the actual website. It says online eLCAP template. You are the first to get it, by the way. So no one has gotten that, and even our viewers that are online right now will not have it until the end of our session here today. So you can see that it says ito.laco.edu/LCAP. That's how you will access the online LCAP. Now, some of you are already saying, do we have to use it? No, it's optional. Some of you would prefer to use that Word document, right? So it's up to you, but I'm going to demo it for you so that you can see the features within this online version. So let's get you to that online. Okay, once you log on and have created that username, you are going to pretty much create a local accountability plan, okay? So it's very self-explanatory. This is going to be the screen where it's called the main menu. So you create a local accountability plan, and I'm just going to show you that screen. And you can see this screen will ask you to identify a title. It will ask you what type of plan is this. And I'm going to use my mouse because I am not. Okay, so it will ask you, are you creating it for a district, a county office, or a charter? Once you identify that, then you go into your counties, and you'll see all the counties in California located here. If you click on Los Angeles, you will see your district here, okay? I assure you, or your charter school. So very, very easy in order to create a plan. Your plan years, all of us are creating a, how many years? 3-year plan, and you'll see that's already the default window there from July 1st, 2014 to the June 30th, 2017. Again, you'll place the LEA contact information here and create the plan. So you'll click that link. You have now started your LCAP plan. Pretty easy, correct? Okay, let's go back to the main menu. I've already started a plan to show you the different sections. Okay, I've started, and of course our favorite district is ABC, and I think there are representatives from ABC. Unfortunately, I haven't added more than just one goal ABC, so okay. So this is your I call it the home page. Our tech plan calls it the plan index. You'll see there are 3 sections. There are the 3 sections that you are required to complete as you have in that State Board approved template. You have stakeholder engagement, you have goals and progress indicators, you have actions, services, and expenditures. These should sound very familiar. Karen just walked you through each section. You also have an introduction, and that introduction takes me back to that screen that indicated your district, your years. That will just take me back. So let's see section 1. So remember, section 1 required you to involve your stakeholders. And we've included from the template, from the blue sheets that you have in front of you, we included the same information, the description, We've also included the guiding questions, and look how great this is. I can show it, so I don't always have to see it, okay? See that? I can hide it, hide the description, I can hide the guiding questions, okay? Now remember, in this first section, they are basic text boxes. You talk about your involvement process, and then once you finish the involvement process, and we've given you some little hints here, we said refer to guiding questions 1, 2, 3, and 5 when completing this section. So you will go ahead and type your what you did to involve all of your specific stakeholders. Very, very important. I don't want you to forget this. There's no save button. It says update section text. So you'll update your section text. Okay, so we have those little save buttons at the end of each of those text boxes. Now remember, the next section that you will complete, impact on eLCAP. Correct? All of your, whatever input you got from your stakeholders, now you're going to describe it in the second text box. Pretty simple, correct? For section 1, we said that's perhaps the easiest one. You can also preview section 1. Look at this. I can preview it, and it will show you exactly what you've done. Okay, close window tab. Okay, so let's go back to our main menu, or I'm sorry, our plan index. I have referenced that as a home page. Now we have section 2. Remember, these are your goals and progress indicators. So let's take a look at how that section is laid out. Again, you have the same information there. Remember the description and your guiding questions, and I can show those or hide those, okay? I'm gonna hide them right now so that we can see the actual inputting of the information. Oops, I went to the wrong one, sorry. Goals and progress indicators. Okay, so the same thing, okay, descriptions and guiding questions. Okay, so here is where you're going to input your goals. So we have, we've inputted, you just add a new goal. That's basically it. So we've started a goal, so I'm just going to press the edit button because we're going to look at all the information that needs to be inputted into the goal area. So here's a basic title, goal title. I want to know fast and easy what this goal is referencing. So your goal title is just a simple way to identify that goal. You can see your state priorities are listed here. You see that? So you can actually click one, or you can actually click a few. So you have that ability. You can also, in this text box, indicate any local priorities that you have identified. The next box is you're going to identify the applicable student groups. And remember, Karen referenced all the ethnic subgroups and the other, the socioeconomically disadvantaged, and our new subgroup, remember, foster youth? So you just indicate who this goal applies to, or if it applies to all. Okay, you see that? Now here, the next section of the box, you've indicated, you're going to indicate it, will this be for all the schools in my district, or will it just be for the elementary, middle, or high school? You have that ability to identify the specific schools. Next, this is the area where you're going to identify your specific goal. So let's take a look here. Define the goal. Pretty easy. All students will be proficient in English Language Arts core standards. Okay, the next section, remember, you had to identify how did you come up with that goal? What was the need identified in your district or charter school? So based on the results of district benchmark data and standardized tests, many of you will reference based on data, correct? Based on that required data. That's how we came up with the identified need to establish a goal in that area. Now, how am I going to measure progress in that area? As Karen described, you're going to have to identify the metric. Okay, how will you know, how will you measure improved performance in that area? And remember, within the state priorities, as Karen mentioned, you're required to use certain data, so please reference back the data that you are required to use. eLCAP year 1, okay, this will indicate the progress changes expected for students in the year indicator. What will be different for students. So you're going to say the percentage of students proficient will increase by whatever. Okay, we're already seeing some samples of districts saying, you know, some districts are saying they're going to close the achievement gap for specific groups of kids. So, so you indicate that. In year 2, what will be different? Are you going to continue to increase the percentage of kids being proficient? And in year 3. And there's also an ability to add an annual update. Very important, update goals. You can add as many goals as you want. There is no limit. You can see the button down here. You can add more goals. That's up to you. The number of goals is up to you. So let's go back to our plan index. That's section 2. Let's go back to our home page. Now we have section 3. Again, description and guiding questions straight from the template. So here are my annual, remember this section is divided into those 4 specific areas that Karen referenced. The A section, which describes the annual actions for all students. The B section, which describes the additional annual actions for those unduplicated pupils and redesignated English proficient students. Then section C describes the use of concentration and supplemental funds. And section D, which describes the proportionality of services. So let's go and view section A. So you can see in section A, you have the ability to, you can describe your specific actions and services. I can either, well, all of you will be starting with a new action. We've already started one action so you can see the features of this online template. So here, we've started when we were saying ELA coach will provide blank, blank, blank. The level of service, will it be district-wide, school-wide, or other? Okay, other. That feature has been added as well. You're going to describe the applicable years. Are you going to provide that service and action in all 3 years, or are you going to target it maybe only in the first year? That's your decision. And again, anticipated expenditures. You'll describe some anticipated, we've given you an idea here, coaches, perhaps instructional materials. You're just going to brainstorm a list of these are the potential expenditures. So again, update, action and service. And you'll see it will start to populate here. Now at the bottom here, now you're going to be a little more specific. You're going to describe, oops, okay, let's finish that. So now you're going to describe the expenditures. So we've indicated here for our action and service where we're providing ELA coaches, we're actually saying we're going to hire 4 ELA district-wide coaches. This is under certificated salaries. These are the anticipated expenditures for each year. So you get the general idea. Here we've listed the funding source, which is LCFF. Could you list other funding sources? Absolutely. That's up to you. Update item. And all that information is now stored. Can I hold questions? Can I, so we can ask those after. Okay, so this is how the structure of this online system. Let me go back to our plan index. You'll see the same type of features for actions and expenditures for part B. The same thing, it's structured the same way because you're going to be indicating how you're expending funds. You're going to be identifying actions and services for those unduplicated pupils and the expenditures tied to those actions and services. So I'm not going to go into B because it's the same as A. I'm going to show you C. Now this is where you are going to describe, and it gives you again what you have to do in this text box, okay? So you're going to describe how you're using those supplemental and concentration funds in section C. And I'm not going to read all of these directions again to you. This is a text box, just like in your template. I go back I update my section text. Okay, it's been updated. Now I can show you the proportionality, section D. This is also a text box. So you're going to indicate it, you know, the increase based on the percentage. So those are the 3 sections, 1, 2, and 3. We also added another feature so that when fiscal looks at the expenditure and the program people look at the expenditures that you've identified, we can actually get an aggregate of all of those expenditures at the very end, and you will have that as well. And you can see how that feature has captured all of your expenditures by goal area. Okay? Those are the features contained within this online template. I'm going to show you another feature that will be of interest to you. Manage users. Many of you are saying, wait a minute, I want to have a few users helping with this information. So you can see I've added Karen Ryback here. You can actually add as many users as you want, and you can give them the specific access rights. Okay, some people will only be able to read it. You don't want to give them access to edit it. Some people you do want to give access to edit, and others, yeah, I want to show. Let's look at it. So let me go back to Karen. Sorry, actually, let me go back to Karen. Update user. You can see that it won't let me do 2 things at one time. I always have to finish my action. So update user. So here you know, does she have the ability to edit? Yes or no, read only. So you can see you can control the access. So I think that's a real critical feature for many of you in your district. So those are the manage features. As you have seen in the ribbon index up at the top, you can always view the plan by section, or you can view the plan as a whole. One of the other things you can do, and I hope I will have addressed your question, because I asked our programmers, I said, right now you can only download in PDF, and some of you saw that. And some of you said, oh, you know, PDF documents, I can't rework some of the charts, and I perhaps want to pull out some information for certain groups of stakeholders. They are currently working on on allowing you to download the document into Word, and that feature will be built in. What's nice about the online template is when they do upgrades, it automatically will upgrade your template. So, so those are the features. The last thing I didn't show you is we will provide additional information. Right now, under documents, you do have a copy of the state's template. We will also add some more instructional features. As you can see, from January to the end of February, we've worked really hard, and we're continuing to add features. I know there were questions. I'll take questions now if you come up to the microphone. And I'm going to have Greg come up, just in case I need his assistance.
So I had a quick question. So as the manage user feature sounds very nice. So are you recommending that if multiple people are working on the document, that if multiple people have the ability to edit versus reading to the overriding? How do we manage changes?
So you asked a good question. The last person wins. Whoever makes the last change online. You can have as many users online. So you have to really establish a protocol for who gets to edit. But if you have 3 editors online at the same time, the last person wins.
So you could build some internal structures that
yes,
say,
absolutely. That's up
highlight
to you.
different put your name on it or something. Something you can internally manage.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
2 questions. One, some of the state websites have information that like middle school and high school dropout rates. So would there be an ability for this program eventually to import that information? That's the first question. And second question, can this be uploaded to the state like it is, or we print it out and send it? How does that work?
Well, are you a county office?
No, I'm a district.
You're a district. So your plan will come to the county office.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
That's right.
So the reason why we created this is we have an approval system that will be built into this online template. That fiscal will approve certain sections and the program people will approve certain sections. And we will have that feature built in for us. And you will be able to submit just like they do the tech plan.
Yeah, that's correct. We also plan to put a button up for enhancements. So if you have something that you'd like to see changed, we'll have a mechanism to collect that kind of information. And then we'll review it. There's no guarantees we can do it, but if a lot of people want the same thing, we'll look to make those enhancements as we move forward.
Okay, with the quantifying within the eLCAP, so we basically have to quantify our budget again within the eLCAP? Doesn't our budget support the eLCAP? Or is it only for the supplemental?
That's a great question, Colette. Let me make my way over to the front of the room. Part of the responsibility of the county office in the review of your eLCAP and your budget is to determine if your budget contains expenditures that are sufficient to implement the goals, the actions you identified. The eLCAP, the regulations require that you specify how much money each of those actions will cost. And by you providing the information at the level we've asked for it, I can look at your budget and I can say, okay, you said you're going to do this coach. It's going to cost this much in salaries. I can draw it over and I can see where that's at in your budget. Remember, your eLCAP drives your budget. And so while that process might seem clunky to you right now because it's not something we're used to having the restrictions and the funding drive our budget. So this is a different shift, a different mindset, but really that makes sense. You know, you're identifying these are the primary goals for my students. This is how much it costs. This is where it's going to be. Plug that in your budget. The other question, if I anticipate the next question somebody will ask me, is does the total expenditures reflected in the eLCAP have to equal my total either in my budget or in my LCFF? No. I would expect to see most of your LCFF in your eLCAP. Most. But there are some expenditures that are very difficult to capture in your eLCAP. For instance, your payroll clerk. How do you define what goal your payroll clerk's meeting? It's a necessary expense. And it's likely coming out of your unrestricted your LCFF. But most of your expenses, your eLCAP's addressing your services for all your students, so most of your LCFF expenses should be in there. So most is reasonable, but I don't have to see all. And because this addresses the statute, the mandate is only for your LCFF. You can choose to put more in, but so there may not be a one-to-one tie into your budget. But this should be driving this now as your planning tool. So again, remember, this is not just a change in a funding model. This is a change in total approach.
I had two questions. The first is, charter schools submit their plan to?
Their authorizer.
Their authorizing agency, okay. And then if you have a grade span school, K through 8, it indicates that you should choose elementary or middle school. Which one do you choose?
There's an other in there.
Other?
You could describe other. I actually choose both elementary and middle, and that would tell me that you serve K through 8th grade students.
So you choose both. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
So Marlene, if I heard you correctly, the eLCAP, at a minimum, we have to include our LCFF revenue. If we want to go ahead and include our federal and other state revenue, we can do that, but at a minimum, base grant, supplemental, and concentration if we get any of that.
That's correct. The eLCAP should reflect your use of those LCFF funds. And the eLCAP is, you should reflect your goals for all your students. Like I said, there are a few expenses that are going to be difficult to find within the goal. So reasonably, most of your LCFF revenue. So when I look at that expenditure, I'm going to see most. If you wanted to have a complete picture I believe Karen talked to you about that. If you wanted to have a complete picture, feel free to add other funding sources that you might want to be able to define. These are all the services we're providing for that student.
Okay, seeing that there are no more questions, I've given you a one-page handout. There is also an email address that if you have if you need technical assistance related to the online eLCAP, there is an email that you can send your question to. It's helpdesk@laco.edu.
If you would add eLCAP to the subject line.
And add, yes, thank you, Greg. He's saying if you would add eLCAP to the subject line, because as you know, our technicians get very, very busy. Lastly, at the bottom of this one-page sheet, you also have LACO's website for LCFF and eLCAP information. The PowerPoint that was used today has already been uploaded there, so you can access the PowerPoint. We will also upload the other documents that were used today.
You are the first group that we've had this entire 3 sections, and we thought it just made more sense to do the budget, to do the eLCAP, and do also a new platform that for your consideration. Again, if you want to do it in the template that the state gave you, that's fine with us. One of the things that in doing electronic version, make sure that you've decided who is going to be the manager of that, and then make the other decisions of who else will have access, because we're going to review this, and so we don't want to get 2 versions, you know, because somebody else logged in with another password, and we've got Downey with 2 eLCAPs here. So thank you very much. We appreciate you attending and letting us do a run through with you. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.